Queensland and New South Wales face blackouts as the energy crisis worsens. Bitcoin tumbles to its lowest level in 18 months, and New South Wales pushes to replace stamp duty with land taxes. It's Tuesday, the 14th of June, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael. Now, look, I have a confession this morning.
Oh, please go on. I love any podcast that starts with a confession, so I'm all ears. Carry on.
Much of the country had a long weekend for the Queen's birthday, but not Queensland and Western Australia. And I've got to tell you, Michael, when we were talking about this last week and deciding how we were going to handle it, and obviously we had a show yesterday, a slightly shorter version, I thought to myself, I wonder how much of the population is in Western Australia and Queensland, because maybe this isn't the right thing to say, but that does kind of bias what we would do. 30% of Australia's population are in Western Australia and Queensland. I was really surprised by that.
It's quite a large chunk of the population. It's certainly more than I expected. I suppose because there's large sections of both states that are outback, essentially. You kind of have this perception of the population being smaller, but particularly because of Queensland, it does make up
Southeast Queensland. Yeah, it's huge numbers.
And I'll tell you, Sean, we had some really good feedback as well from our public holiday episode yesterday. One from Dom, listening in Brisbane, who said, the podcast is always an excellent listen. Thanks for thinking of those north of the border.
Well, I'm really pleased that we did a full episode yesterday, because I've got to say, this time last week I was thinking maybe we won't do one. We would have totally let listeners down, the 30% of listeners anyway who are working, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, look, we're back. Everything's back to normal. Everyone's back at work except those that are taking an extra long weekend.
And good on them.
And I'm sure there's a few of them. And wouldn't it be nice to be one of those, Sean? But instead, we've got plenty to talk about today, including a chat that's coming up a little bit later on with Katrina Burns from Wilson Asset Management about investing in international stocks.
Yes, very interesting. We always think about the big Australian companies. Well, Katrina is based in New York, and she gives us a bit of a rundown, not necessarily on the big international companies, but certainly a few that she's looked at that she thinks are worth considering.
Yeah, it's a good one that's coming up a bit later on. But the main story this morning, Sean, the national energy crisis is worsening. There were fears that parts of Queensland would go into blackout last night and concerns about New South Wales this evening.
That's right, and the National Energy Market Operator has directed electricity generators in Queensland to switch on plants to avoid blackouts. They'd gone off after the introduction of a cap on prices in that state. That cap left some generators unprofitable, so hence they turned them off. The Australian Energy Market Operator forced the generators to continue to meet consumer demand in Queensland. New South Wales will be the focus today, with peak load expected between 6 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. tonight. The regulator has already said it expects an electricity shortfall. Now, the AEMO, that's the Australian Energy Market Operator, has also activated what's known as the Reliability and Emergency Reserve Trader Scheme. Basically, it's a scheme that rewards users for saving energy. The crisis has been driven by the failure of several coal-fired power stations due to technical faults and coal supply issues. AGL's Bayswater generator in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales and the Loy Yang A generator in Victoria are all operating below capacity. So that's the supply side. At the same time, demand has surged due to the cold temperatures we've been experiencing.
Sean, what's the government doing about this? I know that makes me sound a little bit like a whinger. What's the government going to do about it? But what is the government doing?
Well, I mean, they're not doing anything about it, but there's not much they can actually do. The meeting of the federal and state energy ministers last week agreed on a plan to address the challenge, but in terms of keeping the lights on in the short term, the broken coal-fired power plants need to be fixed. Hopefully the Bayswater plant will be repaired within the next week. We just sort of have to hope for better weather, Michael. I mean, trite, but it's true.
Yeah, scary when we are relying on something as unpredictable as the weather.
That's exactly right.
All right. Now, Sean, there was no trading on the ASX yesterday. It was closed, obviously, for the long weekend, but it's a big week for the market.
That's right. Locally, it will be all about the May labour force figures. Will the unemployment rate drop below 3.9% to a new low since the 1970s? The consensus view among market economists is that it can, and that's because there's so many job ads around at the moment. The prospects for the ASX today ain't great. After a sell-off overseas, on Friday, the S&P ASX 200 closed at 6,932 points. That's back to levels that it was trading at around January. It's a really big week overseas, especially in the United States. Last week's 40-year high inflation figure for May triggered a major sell-off in equities. The US Federal Reserve is meeting in the next few days and is expected to lift rates by 50 basis points. Some economists think it might even be higher after last week's inflation data. And then later in the week, the Bank of England is meeting, and it too is likely to raise rates by 50 basis points after lifting by a similar amount last month.
There is plenty happening, and at the same time, digital currencies, Sean, aren't exactly having a good time of it at the moment.
No, Bitcoin yesterday hit its lowest level since late 2020 and is trading just over $25,000 a unit, having dipped below that level around lunchtime yesterday. It's down 45% this year and 62% since its peak in October last year. A bunch of smaller cryptos have also been sold off. Solana, Cardano, Dogecoin and Avalanche suffered double-digit drops yesterday. Now, the reason Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have fallen so much is that inflation and interest rates are rising, and investors don't like risky assets when the economic outlook is so clouded, and digital currencies are risky assets. Away from cryptos, the Aussie dollar is trading just above 70 US cents. That's down a bit. Mind you, it's faring better than the Japanese yen, which yesterday hit a 24-year low against the US dollar. Oil prices also fell a couple of percent yesterday, but are still close to 120 US dollars a barrel. I've got to say, I was pretty excited last night, Michael, to fill up my car at $1.89 a litre.
Ooh, that is quite exciting, isn't it? And that's very sad that we are getting so excited about that.
I know, but very relevant.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, as an aside, there was also a story over the weekend. Gas prices or petrol prices in the US have always been much, much cheaper than Australia. They're pretty much at parity now, which is a real crisis in the US, particularly ahead of the summer driving season, which is where they're going into. Prices in the US are about $5 a gallon, which is about $2 a litre. So there you go.
Wow. All right. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, I mentioned this one at the top of the show. New South Wales wants to replace stamp duty on houses with a land tax, but it needs a bit of help from Canberra.
Yeah, it would be a major reform, not just for New South Wales, but for all states, because it would likely lead to other jurisdictions doing something similar, or at least considering something similar. Stamp duty is a major cost when you're buying a house. On a $1 million home in New South Wales, it's about $43,000. So if you think about it, you have a 20% deposit, or $200,000, stamp duty at $43,000 is a fair chunk of money. New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet said he'd unveil a slew of tax changes in the state's budget next week, aiming at improving housing affordability. Under proposals reported in the Sydney Morning Herald, new home buyers would choose whether they paid stamp duty or an annual land tax on their home. Now, the top 20% of homes will be excluded from having the option, according to the report. But Mr. Perrottet said he needed help from Canberra to fund the proposal. That's not really surprising, given total stamp duty for this financial year for New South Wales is expected to be $13.4 billion. If it is unveiled next week, that is a major, major tax reform, and other states are going to have to think about doing something similar.
Now, yesterday, Sean, we talked about Defence Minister Richard Marles, who is fresh from his meeting now with his Chinese counterpart over the weekend. He's now off to Japan.
Yeah, so we're there for meetings with academic and industry figures as well as Japan's defence minister. His meeting with China's General Wei Fang on Sunday was the first meeting of senior government officials from the two countries in more than 2 years. Many people welcomed that one, and particularly Tim Ford. He's the chief executive of Treasury Wines. Remember, Treasury lost out last year after Beijing put punitive tariffs on wine imports from Australia, including Grange, which is made by Treasury. Anyway, Mr. Marles is off to Japan now and certainly seems to be winning the plaudits of quite a few watchers.
Okay, now this is a good story, Sean. Bubs Australia, the local company that US President Joe Biden thanked for helping solve the infant formula shortage in the United States, is expanding its physical presence now in the world's largest economy.
Yes, Bubs products will be available in more than 4,000 stores across the US after it did a deal with supermarket chains, the Kroger Co. and Albertsons, their regional supermarket chains in the US. The first 747 air cargo flight filled with nearly 300 pallets of Bubs formula left Melbourne over the weekend, and there's another flight due to leave tomorrow. The surge in demand for Bubs products came after a contamination scare at a major producer in Michigan. Bubs' share price jumped 8% on Friday. It's almost doubled over the past 4 weeks, ever since Joe Biden thanked them for sending over infant formula.
Sean, the WA regulator has given approval to Blackstone's proposed acquisition of Crown Resorts.
Sure have. That was the last regulatory approval needed from the 3 states, Victoria, Western Australia and New South Wales, to allow that deal to go ahead. Now it has shareholder support and it now goes to federal court, which is more of a rubber stamp. So Crown will soon be owned by private equity group Blackstone. Its share price on Friday rose 0.5%, and it's basically trading at the offer price. That's a sure sign that everyone is very, very confident the deal will now be done. Blackstone still needs to adhere to a number of tough conditions on the gaming company that were instituted by royal commissions and inquiries in those 3 states. That includes enhanced reporting of anti-money laundering and responsible gambling rules. The next step, of course, is that the Sydney casino is likely to get the go-ahead, the green light, possibly this week, but certainly in the next month or so.
All right, now a bit of an update on a big story from last week, Sean. We talked about Atlas Arteria. They've knocked back IFM investors' request for confidential information after the global investment group bought almost 15% of the Toll Road Group stock.
Yes, IFM wants to have a look at the books of Atlas Arteria before deciding whether to proceed with a $7.8 billion takeover bid. Now, normally you make the bid with conditions and ask to look at the books. But in this case, we have a very large shareholder asking for information that other shareholders may not have access to, because then they'll decide if they want to make the bid. It's very unusual, and Atlas says it's happy to meet IFM to discuss topics on the basis of publicly available information, but Atlas doesn't want to be giving one shareholder information that other shareholders don't have.
No, fair enough. Sean, the Queen's Birthday Honours List has been released, and there were plenty of sports people, plenty of health experts in the list.
Yeah, so not probably as many business people as often come out. Women make up 43% of the list. That's the second highest proportion since honours were introduced back in 1975. The youngest recipient was 23 years old and the oldest was 101. Recently deceased cricketer Shane Warne, recently retired tennis champion Ash Barty, and captain of the Australian women's cricket team Meg Lanning all received honours. Former Chief Medical Officer Brendan Murphy, he became very familiar during the COVID pandemic. Queensland Governor and former Chief Health Officer for the state, Jeanette Young, and New South Wales Chief Health Officer Kerry Chant were also awarded, and former Qantas Chair and Rio Tinto Chief Executive Lee Clifford received Australia's highest civilian honour, a Companion of the Order of Australia.
And Sean, Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of the late US President John F. Kennedy, has been sworn in as ambassador to Australia.
She said she was grateful for the opportunity to represent her country to a vital ally. That's how she put it. Ms. Kennedy, of course, was formerly US ambassador to Japan. She knows the region well and certainly brings a little bit of pizzazz to the ambassador's position, Michael.
Yeah, you can say that again. I love that story. All right, moving on to overseas news, and Google has paid a $118 million settlement over claims that it underpaid women.
3 former Google employees sued the company in 2017, saying the tech giant paid men more than women for doing exactly the same job. The settlement covers about 15,500 women employed in California. Now, Google has long thought of itself as egalitarian, and a company spokesperson said it was very happy to have reached an agreement. Microsoft and Oracle, 2 other very, very large tech companies, are also facing discrimination lawsuits at the moment.
Senators in the United States have agreed on modest gun reforms following a spate of mass shootings in recent years, Sean.
Very modest, Michael. Now, they've been working on framing a bipartisan approach and have come up with modest gun curbs, that's how it's been put, and increased efforts to improve school safety and mental health programs. It isn't going to get assault weapons off the street. It's a long way from that, but President Joe Biden said at least it was a step in the right direction.
Yeah, a long way, though, from where it needs to be. And finally, Sean, we all know sports rights are critical for broadcasters. We see that here in Australia. But the numbers being thrown around for the rights to cover the Indian Premier League are just sensational.
Yes, the Indian Premier League is the one-day cricket tournament which includes players from all the major cricket-playing nations. It's just been completed. The players themselves earn huge amounts of money for about 5 or 6 weeks' work. According to a report on Bloomberg, bidding for the broadcast rights for the next 5 years has hit $5.8 billion US. That's more than 8.2 billion Aussie dollars for the 5 years. Now, the bidders include some of the biggest media companies in the world, Walt Disney, Sony Group, Viacom. Don't think we've got an outcome yet, but wow, the numbers are eye-watering.
Yeah, that is extraordinary. All right, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview, and we mentioned this earlier. You're speaking with Katrina Burns from Wilson Asset Management.
That's right. Katrina certainly knows her stuff, and what I found really interesting was some of the more obscure companies that she's considering, and went through why she thinks they're worth taking a peek at. Obviously, we're not an investment advice program. Go and see a professional advisor if you want to make an investment, but maybe just listen to Katrina first to see what she thinks.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting chat. It is coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Tuesday, the 14th of June, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.